Hi, welcome everybody to the third installment of Memorial University's Faculty of Education Interview and Expert Series. Today we have Professor Marc Vries, who is a leader in the field of technology education. His main research to date has focused on the you'll have to bear with me, the epistemology of technology, the ethics of nanotechnology, and utopian thinking in technology. His impressive work has been instrumental in preparing educators to promote technological literacy for future generations. In 1982, Marc earned a Master of Science in Physics from Vries University in Amsterdam. He would go on to then earn a PhD in Science Education from Eindhoven University of Technology. Throughout his career, he has been a dedicated professor in philosophy and ethics of technology at the Eindhoven University of Technology, a current professor of science education at the Delft University of Technology, as well as an affiliate professor of philosophy and pedagogy of technology and engineering education at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. Marc holds a vested interest in ensuring insights from the philosophy of technology become integrated into the pedagogy of both technology and design. He has been instrumental in the examination of philosophical reflections and their relation to technical artifacts, technological knowledge, and design processes that highlight the relation between technology and humans in society. Through his extensive research, he has examined a vital link between how technology and design can be both taught and learned. Hi, Dr. Vries. Thank you. We want to thank you first for being here with us, and we appreciate your time, and we know that our viewers today are so excited for you to lend some insight as being the major contributor to our coursework this term. So for today's interview, we wanted to talk to you a little bit about a specific chapter from the Handbook of Technology Education entitled The Philosophy of Technology Themes and Topics. In this chapter, you provided what you have called a concise survey of what has been developed so far in the philosophy of technology. Since then, have you continued your research in this realm, and is there anything new that you would like to share with us here today?
Yeah, well, it's an ever-continuing topic, of course. So yeah, I've been following that and contributing that to it. I must say that most of my time, actually, I'm in science and technology education, so philosophy is only one day in a week, so I can't contribute that much, of course, to this field, but my interest is still a bit in epistemology, it's a word, isn't it? Even I stumble over it. But a more recent interest is also utopian thinking. That's more, let's say, social aspects of technology kind of thing, and I'm particularly interested now in the way technology is expressed in terms of very far-reaching promises, as if it is going to do everything to save the world. So it's a sort of utopian view on technology, and I'm particularly interested in looking at the way that is expressed, for instance, in all sorts of advertisements. Particularly the use of the word unlimited is interesting to see, because it's suggested then that an ideal world is a world in which there are no limitations. So it is the best thing you can have is unlimited mileage, or unlimited data, or unlimited tapas, or whatever. And so my critique on that is that you can really wonder if that is the case. If it is really the best of life when there is no limitations. With the unlimited tapas, I guess you'll soon find out that if you really want to follow that in the night, you'll find out that utopia has turned into a dystopia then, because you're probably feeling very bad because of all the tapas you try to eat. So that is the sort of thing I'm looking at now, this intriguing idea of utopian thinking in terms of unlimitedness.
Which is excellent, and I know that that's been a heavy topic of conversation for us here this semester. Something else that you mentioned in the chapter that we have seen several times throughout the course, again so far this term, is the concept of normativity. You say that normativity features in various forms in technical standards, rules of thumb, good practices, and also functions. With production of technological artifacts happening worldwide, how do you think demographic differences impact what normativity is seen as in the tech sector?
Well, indeed, normativity is different, or at least the norms that you use are different in different demographic domains, as well as geographic domains, and even through time it changes. And that is, of course, because normativity is something that you can choose in a way. Not that you cannot choose if there is normativity, because there will be. Because if you design something in technology, you will have an opinion on it. This is, by the way, the big difference between natural sciences and engineering sciences, because natural sciences never have an opinion about the reality. Physicists don't talk about normativity. They don't judge the electron. So if the electron is doing something different than expected, then it is not a malfunctioning electron, it's just a different particle. So the physicist is never complaining about this funny electron doing funny things. No, it's just not an electron that way. But an engineer has an opinion on the drilling machine, so it can be a good drilling machine or a malfunctioning drilling machine or whatever. So normativity is a very important concept in technology, and it is absent in natural sciences. That is why I think that engineering can never be derived from natural sciences, simply because you cannot derive an ought from an is, as we call it in philosophy. So you cannot derive what should be from what is. And yes, there are differences, of course. When you look through time, for instance, the ideas about what is best natural or artificial have changed through time. There was a time that we thought that everything artificial was better. So artificial butter was much better than natural butter, because nature does what it does, and it does all sorts of funny things, and you have no control over it. And so artificial will be better. And now we have shifted in a time when we say, no, natural is better. So now you've got all sorts of eco and bio and whatever products that customer wants, because it is better than artificial. And you can wonder, of course, if they are really that natural, but the label eco and bio says that is good. So it changes through time, and of course it will also change in geography. So what is good for Chinese people is not necessarily good for people from Western industrialized countries. And same for demographic differences. So there's all sorts of different, let's say, content of norms, but normativity is there always. So you always have an opinion on reality as a technologist or an engineer or whatever, contrary to someone in physics or biology or whatever. The difference again, when cells start growing very quickly, the biologist just notes and says, okay, this is what cells do. And it's the doctor who will say, wait, this is a disease, it's cancer. There's normativity there. And so the whole idea of healthy or sick is not in biology, it's in medical sciences. It's the same sort of difference. The normativity is in medical sciences and not in biology.
I think that's a great place for us to start with our own students going forward conceptually, so thank you very much for that. In your chapter, you discuss the ways in which the philosophy of technology has evolved in the wake of the shift from theoretical to empirical discipline, or the empirical term of the 1990s. Do you believe that this also marked a turn from the more dystopian way of thinking about technology? And I know you briefly touched on this, but we were just wondering if we could circle back a little bit.
Yeah, well, that's a very good observation, because the originally philosophy of technology was dominated by people who were not engineers, who didn't have a technological background, so they were real philosophers, you could say, like the Heideggers, the Ellul's, etc., etc. and they were all negative about technology. So of course, it was when they wrote, it was in the 50s, 60s. No, sorry, that was the age in which technology was seen as very positive. But they started writing by the end of the 60s, early 70s, and in that time you could see a whole social change towards science and technology, and suddenly there was a lot of suspicion about science and technology. So you could see the environmental issues appearing on the political agendas, and there was social unrest, students' revolts, all this kind of thing. So it was a whole dynamic period. And so a lot of people felt unhappy about what happened in society, and the general feeling was that technology was dominating, and that was a very unpleasant feeling, and people felt like they were being controlled by technology rather than controlling over technology. That also has to do with the fact that they were speaking about and writing about technology in a very generalized way, as if everything is the same as computers and the internet and all those kind of things. And so when one particular technology felt threatening, they blamed all technologies at the same time. Now, when this empirical turn came up, people with a science and technology background started becoming interested in philosophy of technology. I myself, for example, I have a background in physics, as you just told. My colleague Peter Cruz in Eindhoven also has a physics background. My boss in Eindhoven, when I was still working there, Anthony Myers, has a background in mechanical engineering. So a lot of people with physics, chemistry, engineering backgrounds became interested in philosophy of technology, and they could look into the nature of technology much more from an inside view. So Heidegger didn't know anything about technology from an inside view because he'd never been an engineer. In fact, only Wittgenstein was an architect himself, so he could judge a little bit more what technology was like, but most of them were not familiar with technology from inside, and so they were negative. They were kind of scared of technology. The one exception in that period was Karl Marx, who was very positive about technology because he believed that technology was in the hands of the laborers, and technology and technological production was what would make the big difference in society. And as it was in the hands of the laborers, they had the power, or at least the potential, to make this big social change that, in the eyes of Marx, would be the necessary outcome of history. But he was the exception. So he was very positive about technology, but the others were all negative. Now, when all these engineers started to become interested, of course, they still felt engineers. So they weren't quite happy with all these negative stories about the engineers being the nasty blokes who destroyed the environment, etc. And so they showed that there is quite a bit of difference between different technologies, and that also the whole image of technology is much more nuanced than these early philosophers of technology suggested. And so definitely, yes, that was a move away from a dystopian kind of view on technology. And perhaps it has shifted a bit too much now in direction of this utopian view of technology, although still the philosophers of technology always have a sort of tendency to be the sort of, pain in the neck of all people. And so they also tend to warn for utopian expectations, because they, of course, as engineers know that you can't make an ideal world with technology. If there's one breed of people that knows that, it is the engineers themselves, because they know that it's always necessary to strike compromises and do that kind of thing. So there will never be an ideal product. And so a utopian view of technology is very much a political thing or a social thing, and the engineers are rather, let's say, they kind of tend to be careful with that, because they realize you can't make an ideal product, and they know it because they're experienced in it.
Yeah, exactly, and to lend on the concept of engineering in relation to that a little bit, in the chapter as well, you discuss modeling in several different ways. So in terms of engineers creating a physical model through the process of abstraction, parts of reality are lost. So some would say, as you mentioned, this is a necessary action, and others would argue that a model differs too greatly from reality. What are some of the precautions that you would recommend taking during the modeling process to avoid straying too far from the real technological artifact?
Well, in fact, modeling is typically a scientific activity, because in science you do nothing else than making models. You always make a sort of simplified version of reality, because otherwise you cannot manipulate it in mathematics, and it's not easy to understand then. So you sort of simplify it, and you can do that as long as you don't touch reality. So you can just sit back and look at it from a distance, and then you can simplify as much as you want, and you get all sorts of nice mathematical formulas then, very smooth graphs, but it's an idealized world. It's an abstract world, and so the real world is different. And so when you are an engineer and you go back into reality to manipulate it, then you have to be careful with models. And of course, you will still make models because models are useful, because you can try out things that you cannot do in reality. So, but you have to realize that it is an idealized version. So let me give a simple example. When you're an aeronautic engineer, you make a model of an airplane, you put it in the wind tunnel, you have to realize that the ratio between the air molecules and your prototype airplane is much different in this wind tunnel version than it is in the real version, because then your airplane is much bigger and the air molecules are still the same size. So you have to realize that the model is not the same as reality. So when you apply the outcomes of your experiment to reality, you still have to take that step from the model to reality. And so you always have to be a bit careful in applying it too easily, because there is a difference, but still modeling is useful and in engineering even a necessary step, because otherwise you cannot try out things. It makes it better to understand it. Models are also useful to explain. So when you're an architect, you will use a model house to show to a future user, and you can give him, her an impression of what the thing is going to look like. And you cannot do that with a real house, of course, or a real building. So there's all sorts of practical uses for modeling, but the real thing is always different. And suddenly, as when you're the buyer of the house and you get to see a little model, you say, oh, it's nice, little cute, etc. And then the real house, of course, looks different, gives a quite different impression. So in a way, the models are a step from reality, but they're useful. And the funny thing is that when you ask pupils, pupils will say that the model is better the more it resembles reality. That's a bit funny, of course, because the whole purpose of a model is to deviate from reality. So this is a sort of misunderstanding with pupils about models, because they will say the more it looks like reality, the better it is. Well, then the best model is reality itself, of course, but then it's not a model anymore. So there's confusion there, and you have to also, I think it's a challenge for us in technology education to show pupils what the idea of modeling is, that it is meant to give a simplified version. So the better model is not necessarily the one that looks more like reality, but it is the one that strikes the best balance between what you want to do with the model and reality. So if you want to use a model just to test whether how shadows fall when you have a little part of a city or so, that you also model with little houses and so, and you make a lamp go over it, and then you see what the sun does in the course of day and how the shadows will fall. Well, then you don't need to color the houses, because if you only look at the shadow, you don't need to paint the houses, because they can just be black and white. So the model doesn't look like reality, because in reality the models will have a color, the houses will have a color. But the strength of the model is, of course, that I need not paint the houses, because I only need it because I want to show how the shadows will fall. And that is, I think, what we need to make pupils aware of. We do a lot of modeling in technology education, but I think we do way too little about discussing the models with pupils, so that they get an understanding of the nature of modeling. And that, I think, is very, very important to understand engineering in general, and particularly the use of models in engineering.
We want to thank you so much for those comments, Mark. Those are certainly some very vital things that we will carry forth into our own teaching pedagogy for sure. For those of you who are just joining us, we are sitting live with Dr. Marc Vries for a live interview on his background in technology education. And I'm going to turn it over to Darcy to finish up some questions that we had for Mark.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Mark, for being with us. So much of this chapter, you already touched on it briefly. You discuss the distinctions between natural and engineering sciences. In particular, you note that for a long time, technology as an applied science, that paradigm blocked our view, and that now we know there's more at stake. What ways do you believe that the study of technology may have suffered as a result of being conflated with natural or applied sciences?
Well, for one thing, is that philosophy wasn't interested in it. So for a long time, philosophers thought like, well, what's technology? What's the big deal? What can be interesting to look at it? I mean, when you take epistemology, for instance, so that's the reflection on the nature of knowledge. Well, philosophers said, there's no new knowledge in technology. You just apply the knowledge that you develop in natural sciences, and there's nothing particular about engineering knowledge. So the fact that philosophers got interested in engineering and technology much later than in natural sciences. The philosophy of natural science is like at least 50 years old, probably even older. And the philosophy of technology is like more like 20, 30 years that we're really doing it on a larger scale. So that's one way of doing injustice to technology, not making it the object of serious systematic reflection in philosophy. And I think by starting to do that, we've learned a great deal about, and I mentioned the same example of epistemology again. Suddenly we became aware of that this normative notion is there in engineering knowledge, and that it is, well, not unique to technology because medical sciences also has it, but it really makes it quite different than natural knowledge. And so you have to pay attention to it when you educate engineers, for instance. So they will become involved in normativity very strongly. They will talk about functions. Functions is a normative nature. Function is not what the object actually does. It is what the object ought to do. The function of a car is to bring me from A to B. And that is still the function when it's in the garage and when it cannot even bring me from A to B. And that is why it is a malfunctioning or a broke car, because at that moment it cannot do what it ought to do. So this whole idea of normativity in the knowledge of technology is something that really makes technology fundamentally different than natural sciences. And that is why it deserves also special attention to that normativity. And we also have to be aware that this normativity can be a pure functional one in the first place, to bring me from A to B. But when you ask the question, what is a good car? A question that a physicist would never ask, because he doesn't have an opinion on the car. He can just calculate how fast it goes, and well, he can give a nice formula for the motion it makes. But an engineer will be interested in, is this a good car? And then you can say, well, it is a good car if it brings me from A to B. But engineers will soon need to discuss that. Or is that enough? Or is it a good car when it brings me from A to B in a safe way? Or is it a good car when it brings me from A to B in an environmentally friendly way? Is it a good car when it brings me safely from A to B, but also the pedestrians when I pass them or when I perhaps hit one of them? And so normativity is not only functional normativity, but it can very quickly also be moral normativity. But be aware, not all normativity is moral. People quickly think that. As soon as you talk about norms, people think about ethics. You also have pure functional normativity. Does it work properly, yes or no? But it very quickly goes over into moral normativity. I don't know if you've read the latest books by Harari. There's one that's called 21st Lessons for the 21st Century. And in one chapter, he discusses automatic cars. And then he says, well, probably you will get two types of automatic cars. One is the type egoist and one is the type altruist. And they are programmed in such a way that type egoist will always choose for you when an accident is happening, and the type altruist will choose for the pedestrian. So it's incredibly intriguing, of course, how normativity is put in the car. Then it is given the name egoist because it will choose for you in acting. And the altruist version will choose for the pedestrian. And so you, as a buyer, of course, make the choice. You decide what kind of car you want. But from then on, the normativity is in the car. And that's a very intriguing idea, of course. And that's something that physicists are never involved in, have no knowledge about it. It's typical for engineers to think about that, to develop knowledge in that domain. And that is why I think we do injustice to engineering if we overlook that kind of very fundamental issues in engineering.
Absolutely, and I think that's something that we're going to see increasingly as we move towards more things like automatic cars and more technological solutions like that. But in the section on technical knowledge in this chapter, you were talking again about natural science and engineering, and one of the things you touched on was the types of reasoning used in each discipline. What would you say are the biggest pedagogical benefits of engineering using more means-ends reasoning?
Well, I think one of the obvious advantages is that natural science knows only about cause-effect reasoning. When I do this, that will happen. But in practice, I think we more often use means-ends reasoning. There's something that is not going right, and then I start thinking, okay, what can I do about it? And that's means-end reasoning. So you see a problem, so you set yourself a target, and you look for the right means to get it. When you sit on a terrace with a cafe and you have your cup of coffee or whatever you have, your beer, and your table is unstable, then you see the problems that the table is unstable, and you start looking for a little key, a little stone or something to put under it. And so you look for a means to solve the problem, and that is the end. I think in practical life, in daily life, we do that kind of reasoning much more than just cause-effect reasoning. In that same situation, cause-effect reasoning, of course, is useful because you can also ask yourself, how come? Why is it that this table is unstable? What makes it? So what is the cause and the effect? Of course, then you know that's the fact that it's unstable. But I think you're much more interested in finding the solution. And in engineering, by the way, it is not the case that you do means-ends reasoning only in engineering. You use both. That's the interesting thing. So when you start with the design problem, of course, you have an end and you look for a means. But once you have produced the means, the prototype, let's say, then you start doing cause-effect reasoning. So what will happen when I push the on button? And that's a matter of cause-effect, because I know all the physics and chemistry of the device and the mathematics, or the geometry or whatever. And so then I can deduce from what I know about how reality behaves, what the device is going to do when I push the on button. So then I use cause-effect reasoning to predict what the device will do, and if that fits, of course, with my purpose. And then again, I switch to means-ends reasoning, because then I reason, was the good means to reach the end? So in engineering, you constantly alternate from cause-effect to means-ends. And in the whole design process, that is typically what you do. You have to use both types of reasoning. And that, in that respect, engineering is richer in terms of the reasoning patterns that you use than science is.
Absolutely. I actually have a question that circles back a bit to your very interesting example of the automatic cars. So when discussing norms and values, you touched on the ability of the technologies to become moral actors, but that as a society, we are still inclined to leave responsibility to humans rather than delegate them to devices or machines. Is that something that you believe has begun to shift with a rise in like smart technology, whether it's wearable in the home or in vehicles?
Yep. Well, there's different philosophers that go different ways here. For instance, in Enschede, which is our other University of Technology, apart from Delft and Eindhoven, there's a philosopher there, Peter Paul Verbeek, who really thinks that we should ascribe agency, as he called it, to devices. So they can be seen as sort of but things that do actually things. And of course, they do because they act. But the big question, of course, is, do they have intentionality? Do they have an intention when they do something? I'm still inclined to say that no, they don't have intention. And that would be the big difference between human actors and artificial actors, that human actors are the only ones that have real attention, that have self-reflection, that can think about what they're doing. But I think the debate will become more heated when robots become more advanced. When you look at Robot Sophia in a YouTube clip or whatever, you will be very impressed by her sophistication, because she can survive an interview. There are several examples of interviews that were really not set up beforehand, so she really has to improvise. And by now, her repertoire is so big that she can make an impression of getting through this interview in a very natural way. There's only very few instances that she gets stuck, and then she falls back into the old artificial trick by saying something like, "What do you think yourself?" Something like that. But apart from that, she is absolutely able to survive an interview. It's very impressive. And so the further it goes, the more people will be inclined to say, well, actually, she has real emotions, because she can give you a wink, and she can smile, and she has very strong facial expressions. So she really makes the impression that she has emotions. I don't think, in fact, she doesn't have it. But the more they will look like us, the more the question will be, is there still any difference? I think there is still a fundamental difference, because what the robot has is human-like behavior, but the robot doesn't have a human mind. But there are people that say this human mind is just behavior. There is nothing behind that. We are also just matter. We are just a big bag of molecules, and there's all sorts of electric currents going around in our brain cells, and that's what you call brain. And well, that's a naturalistic or a materialistic view of reality. I don't share it. But the more sophisticated these robots get, of course, the more the impression is that the difference gets smaller and smaller. So is there still a real difference? I think yes, but it's deep inside. You need to look very careful. You can sometimes notice because we are still much, much better in improvising. And just to take the example of the automated car, in the beginning, automatic cars often ignored roadblocks because it wasn't in the program. So they just crushed through roadblocks because they didn't know it, so it wasn't there for them. Of course, they've learned by now, so now they recognize roadblocks, but still there are some things that they have never seen before, and so they don't know what to do with that. And then they panic and they do still silly things. Humans can also panic, of course, and we can also do silly things in that situations, but we can also suddenly find that smart solution that deals with the situation in a proper way. And so real creativity, that I think is still human prerogative. I'm quite sure that the behavior of robots, will also become more similar to our creativity, but I think there will still be this real originality lacking in robots. Robots just follow the program, and the program gets more and more sophisticated. They will closely resemble what goes on in our brain cells, but I think that we still have something that is not in that physical brain cell with these electrical currents, but that is closely related to matter. Of course, there's a close relationship. I don't think we are a duality of mind and body. We're one being, but there is definitely a non-physical aspect in us that is independent of this physical aspect. Call it a brain, call it a mind, call it whatever you want to call it. Mind is probably a good word for it. And robots, for me, don't have this as much as it looks. And it has moral implications also. I've seen examples where a robot sister is given to an elderly people with elderly women or men with Alzheimer, and then the reasoning is he or she doesn't notice the difference anyway. So she'll take the artificial nurse for a real nurse, and so who cares? I don't think that does justice to this human being. I mean, as much she can be affected with Alzheimer, it is still a human being in the full sense of the word. And I think it is morally not acceptable to say she doesn't notice a difference. So just give her the nurse robot, much more cheap. Doesn't need to have vacation, doesn't need to go to the toilet every time or whatever. So much more easy. I don't think that does justice to the human being. And that's going to be fundamental discussions that I think will become more and more important the more robotics progresses.
I couldn't agree more. I think as we make advancements in robotics and artificial intelligence, these ethical discussions are going to become increasingly complex, and I think that's something that we as future educators should definitely be prepared for when it comes to dealing with our own students. But I did have one final question for you here, Marc. Looking towards the future of the philosophy of technology, you unpack Kruse and Meyer's prediction of an axiological turn. Since the publication of this chapter, have you observed any shifts, be they axiological or otherwise, within the discipline of technology education?
Yeah, I think there are. In that respect, technology education sort of follows technology, a philosophy of technology, you might say. And of course, my interest was always to try to stimulate that by bringing in ideas from philosophy of technology in the technology education debates. I think technology education started from a sort of a craft background, industrial arts, so seemingly very neutral. You just make the product from a drawing, and when it resembles a drawing and functions, then it's fine. No moral issues there. And now we are moving quickly, I think, into the direction of also including moral discussions in technology education. I think sustainability is one that we're more and more interested in. I think we're still not doing enough about that, but it is something that we've taken interest in. I think also discussions about robotics, because robotics is coming in technology, or has come into technology already since, let's say, 20 years ago or so, in very simple versions. Of course, there's the Lego type of things, but it's also becoming more advanced now. It's all sorts of suppliers also provide us with very nice robots that can do all sorts of things. I have grandchildren, and one of them once was selected for an experiment with the sort of educational robot, and it's really funny to see what the educational robot can do. It's really like sort of a mate for him, and he can ask him questions, and he has emotional expressions also. Even it's a simple thing actually, but it's still quite progressed. And so I think that for the future of technology education, I expect that these moral or normative questions, more broadly perhaps even, will become more and more important in technology education. because this is also happening in society. So I think if we want to stay relevant, if we really want to generate a next generation that is technologically literate, this is definitely one of the necessary components that we have to pay attention to, because they will end up as citizens in a world in which all these moral debates about technology will be increasingly going on. And they must have some kind of background in that in order to be a serious player in that game. And it's our big challenge, I think, to help them understand that. And that implies that we teach them all sorts of basic concepts, because this whole debate needs knowledge about concepts. So you need to understand what normativity is. You need to understand what morality is. You need to know what good and bad is, etc. So many things. The notion of functions, you need to realize that it is indeed a normative notion, not a descriptive one. So all these things that we can learn a lot of things there from natural sciences or science education, because science education has a tradition in concept learning, and I think we should also pick that up and make sure that we also teach, or make sure that our pupils, our students, learn the concepts that are needed to have a decent debate about morality. So you cannot just take part in that debate if you don't understand the basic concepts. And it's our challenge, I think, to teach those concepts, and then also teach the students to use those concepts in a decent contribution to a moral debate. And that will be, I think, more and more important for technology education in the future. So we're moving away from making candlesticks and bird cages, which is good, but we still have a whole road ahead of us. But I think we've taken that path, and I'm quite sure that as time goes on, we will recognize the necessity of that more and more, and I'm sure that we will have the creativity and also the responsibility to become more and more engaged in that.
I would definitely agree with that. I think it's imperative that we, as future educators, know to try and make space for moral and ethical discussions with our students, and build them in with the technical concepts that they are learning. But I think that is something we can look forward to in the future, and something that we can certainly, hopefully, help them along with.
Yeah, and not put it in a separate box, like, okay, today we're going to do the morality, but try to include it in the normal activities that we do. So when we do a design project, try to build in some kind of stimulus to think about moral issues. So if you put it in a separate box, then it's something that you'll tick off and you'll just go back to what you're doing, and then you miss the point. So it is something that you should really integrate into the normal thing that you do.
Absolutely. I think weaving it in among the actual kind of activities that the students are doing is really going to make a difference in them engaging with the material and really kind of taking the ethical and moral discussions to heart.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Marc, we want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today and for sharing your expertise with our viewers here at Memorial University and out there in the cyber world. You have provided a wealth of information for us today, and we hope that educators and students alike can take this information going forward and will benefit from it as they pursue their own fields their own careers in the field of technology. We want to thank you for your contributions to the field, and we look forward to following any future work you may have going on. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Yeah, it's nice seeing you. Nice talking with you, contributing to your program. And so, well, maybe see you next year for the conference.
Absolutely.
Hopefully.
Take care.
Good for you.